of our series English Thought and Culture. Today, this is the first part of a two-part series where we look at the whole area of the British Empire. Okay, so let's start again. So here, this course is English Thought and Culture. This is lecture 11, entitled The British Empire and India. And we're going to look at a particular book, A Passage to India by E.M. Forster. But first we're going to look at some of the ideas of the British Empire and Britain's presence, a long presence, in India. Now, I'm sure I'm an Englishman, so obviously I think England is very important. I think English culture and literature and language is very important. But there really would have been no reason for you in Saudi Arabia to think English is important, except for the fact of the experience of the British Empire. So before we start the lecture, let's look at some of the history and the facts surrounding the British Empire. Okay, you remember my name, Jake Organ, and there's how to get in contact with me. So let's look at a few facts about the British Empire. And it was the British Empire that caused the English language, caused English thought, English culture, English literature to become something that influenced the whole world. Last week we were looking at a particular part of the British Empire, the United States of America, that rebelled against the British Empire. And that happened in around the 1780s. So that was the early stage of the British Empire, but after America broke away to become its own country, Britain carried on building its empire, which grew and grew and grew for another 150 years. So the British Empire, at its height, it was the largest empire in history. So it's bigger than the Roman Empire, bigger than any other human empire. Now we talk about empire is when one country conquers other countries and builds a system of government in those countries, like in Rome, what happened among the early Arabs, what happened, the Chinese, the Mongols. Many people have tried to build empires, but the British Empire was the largest empire in history. In 1922, the British King ruled over 458 million people, 1/5 of the world's population. Now, if you know, Britain has got 60 million people, so that would be 1% of the world's population, but it ruled over 20% of the world's population. That's an incredible statistic. The empire also covered 1/4 of the world's land surface. It was called the empire where the sun never sets, because it was said that the British Empire at its height, the sun was always bright at one part of the empire, because it covered so much of the world. So it might have been night in Britain, but it was day in, say, South Africa, or day in Kenya, or day in India, or in Canada. So It was a vast thing. So it was a quarter of the world's land surface. It started up as a trading empire in the Elizabethan age and during the time, the 17th century and 18th century. Merchants, adventurers, even pirates, they went out and they established trading bases. But after a time, when the British Army and the British Navy tried to back up the efforts of these merchants, they started to get involved in military conquest, and British people started to go and settle in other places, and they started what is called colonialism. Basically, one country dominating another to basically to help develop that country at times, but mainly to get raw materials, to exploit the economy of that country. And this is what Britain did a lot of, colonialism. The British Empire had both positive and negative effects, especially on its colonies, you know. One of the positive effects is it left a legacy, so a legacy meaning the result of it being there, of education and social stability in many of its colonies. Now this is important. As a young, well, I'm not, I still call myself young, person from Britain, we grew up with a bit of a negative view of the British Empire. We look back and think this was a bad thing to do. We did many bad things in many countries. But if we take a balanced view of the British Empire, we realise that there was a lot of positive things from the British Empire as well. Not least the legacy of education and stability that we left in many countries. It's not all good, but there were some good things. Let's look at British India. Now this, in a way, India was a very important part of the British Empire. From 1757 to 1858, the British East India Company ruled India. This was a trading company, a company that was taking spices and various raw materials from India, various goods from India. But it was a company, but it was also backed up by force. They had troops, they had a military. Okay. So they ruled India, but from 1858 to 1947, there was the British Raj, or the Indian Empire. This was direct rule from Britain. Like the King of Britain ruled, or the Queen at that time, ruled India directly. The word Raj is the Hindi word for reign. So we can see that when we talk about the British Raj, it's something a little bit mixed. We've brought a Hindi word in, we've brought an English word, and that says something about Britain's experience in India. We changed India, but then India changed us as well. India is called the jewel in the crown of the British Empire because of its beauty, the great beauty of India, and importance to the British people. It was a very important part of the empire. So the British East India Company were first given permission to trade in India in 1617, a long time ago, and they expanded their influence over the next century and a half until they ruled India in 1757. In 1857, there was a large uprising against the British East India Company. and it was called the Indian Mutiny, which led to direct rule from Britain. So after the Indian Mutiny, the British government said no, the British East India Company will not rule India anymore. We will rule directly. Okay? So let's have a look at some of the influences that Britain left upon India. Incredible fact, the Indian subcontinent, India, Pakistan and Bangladesh, has more fluent English speakers than anywhere else, even the USA. You know, the amount of people that speak, we're not talking about, you know, a little bit of English, we're talking about absolute fluent English, is more than any other country. You know, that's including the USA. Some of the greatest writers in the English language are from India. For example, Vikram Seth, Arundhati Roy, V.S. Naipaul, who won the Nobel Prize for Literature. He's actually from Trinidad, but he's of Indian origin. These are some of the greatest writers in the English language. And this is an incredible fact. India produces more English-speaking graduates than the rest of the world put together. So people that are studying degrees in the medium of the English language, maybe in computing or engineering, but in English, so produces more graduates than the rest of the world put together. And we all know that in many, many countries, from the UK to East Africa to even in the Gulf, there are many, many skilled workers in computers, in doctors and nurses, all sorts of people that are from India, Pakistan or Bangladesh, mainly from India. You know, that they can export their people because they're so well educated. This has allowed India, especially India, to become an economic superpower through the world of computers, cabling, call centres and the internet. Yeah, India is said to be now, I believe, the second biggest economy in the world. There's a great level of prosperity among the middle classes that's mainly come through the world of computers, the internet, call centres, and their ability to use the English language. So the Raj left a strong infrastructure, education system and legacy of stability. You know, India is the world's largest democracy, and though it has problems, it basically has a level of stability which you can say is something to do with the British. Okay? Now what about the other way round? How has India influenced Britain? For example, my grandmother was born in India. Her family went to India. They were a Scottish family, but they went to India to plant tea, to take over some land and start a tea plantation. And my grandmother was actually born in India. She would tell stories of her childhood in India. And that was the case for many, many British people, many British people. Okay, so many British people lived and worked in India in the first half of the 20th century. Even in the 19th century, you know, you'll meet a lot of families who had experience in India. The most popular dish in the UK is chicken tikka masala. Britain loves their Indian food. It's probably the most popular food there is. The number of immigrants to the UK from the Indian subcontinent may be more than 4 million. If you go to the East End of London, if you go to Birmingham, if you go to many of the northern cities, you know, you'll see a number of people from India, Pakistan and Bangladesh, and they've deeply influenced British culture. There are very, very strong trade links between India and the UK. Very, very strong. Also between Pakistan and the UK. A lot of British literature was influenced by the author's experience in India. So like great English writers like Rudyard Kipling, E.M. Forster and G.J. Farrell wrote about their experiences in India. And it's part of the heritage, the knowledge of British people. And probably also, more importantly, a lot of British ideas of upper class life and Britishness, what it means to be British, come from our experience in India. Yeah, it's a lot of like the idea of particular social etiquette, garden parties, different things like that, came from how we portrayed ourselves as the ruling class in India. There's a lot I could say about that, but we'll just leave it there. But there was a negative side of the Raj as well, a negative side of British rule in India. Let's look at some of that so we can be balanced. The British rulers were very racist towards the Indians. They saw the Indians as lower than them and could be brutal in dealing with any rebellion. As we'll see in the book we're going to look at, you know, they were racist and they could be very brutal. After the Indian Mutiny of 1857 was stopped in 1858, over 100,000 Indians had been killed. So when there was this mutiny against the rule of the East India Company, you know, the British killed a lot of people, maybe up to 100,000 people. In 1919, British troops fired on a big group of unarmed protesters in the city of Amritsar, the famous city of the Sikhs, the people with the turbans. They killed up to 1,000 people. This was called the Amritsar Massacre. You know, these were unarmed protesters against British rule. And the British Empire's main goal was to make money, and they took a lot of Indian resources and prevented the Indian economy from industrialising and modernising. So there's a sense that during the British Raj, the British kept the Indian economy down. We just wanted the raw materials that we could go and sell in Europe. And so we didn't help the Indian economy to develop. Also, the British government did not plan their withdrawal, their exit from India very well. And this led to many deaths when India was partitioned between Muslim India, Pakistan and Bangladesh, and Hindu India, which was the present-day country of India. And when they partitioned the borders, they did not organise it well, and this led to a lot of people dying. Okay, we're going to look at a book, a particular book, a famous book about the British experience in India. This is A Passage to India by E.M. Forster. So, let's look first at E.M. Forster, a classic English novelist. So, Edward Morgan Forster, that's E.M. Forster. He was born on the 1st of January 1879. So, who would have been Queen? Victoria, in the Victorian age. But he died on the 7th of June 1970. So he had a long life, 91 years. He was an English novelist, short story writer and essayist. He wrote essays. He wrote many famous novels, including Howard's End, A Room with a View, Where Angels Fear to Tread, and A Passage to India. Howard's End and A Room with a View are really classic books, again about, a bit like Pride and Prejudice, about the upper class life and the etiquette of upper class life. So they're very well worth reading. He wrote a little bit like Jane Austen. He wrote a lot about British hypocrisy and the class system. Now, the word hypocrisy is about people that say one thing and do another. And so when he was observing the British in India, he was talking a lot about hypocrisy. Britain saying they were there to be good, but doing bad things. You know, things like this. So he lived for a few years in India in the early 20s, and his observations of Indian society led him to write A Passage to India. A Passage to India, it's one of the greatest novels about the British experience in India. It won Forster a major literary prize. It's listed as the 25th best English language novel of the 20th century. So it's up there. Made Forster a commercial success. It was actually turned into a very famous film by David Lean, which won many Oscars. And if you can watch that film, I would recommend it. It's called A Passage to India. Again, like the Pride and Prejudice. You know, if you find the book a bit difficult, watch the film, because it's very beautifully shot. It's beautiful video, you know, camera work about India. It's really lovely. The main characters are Dr. Aziz, the main Indian character, Cyril Fielding, the main British man, Adela Quested, and Mrs. Moore. So these are the key characters in the book. Okay, let's have a look at some of the quotes. Now, often when you're reading a book, you're hearing the words or reading the thoughts of one of the characters. But often, what the characters are expressing or saying is what the author thinks. Okay? So here we have Dr. Aziz thinking about the British in India, but really this is what E.M. Forster is thinking. So the roads in India, named after victorious generals and intersecting at right angles, very British, very organised, was symbolic of the net Great Britain had thrown over India. He felt caught in their meshes. So here is Britain thinking that it's civilising this country, bringing all these roads and trains and everything being ordered. But really, what they were doing was throwing a net over this country, and people were being caught in the net. Again, here's another thing. This is one of the characters, Ronnie Hislop, who is he's a British administrator, really believes in what the British are doing in India. But E.M. Forster is sort of saying, one touch of regret. You know, if he started to think what he was doing, not the canny substitute, not the, you know, not pretend regret, but the true regret from the heart, would have made this man, Ronnie Hislop, a different man, and the British Empire a different institution. Because he's saying that if some of these people that were running India and running these colonies actually thought about what are they doing to these people, maybe it would have changed them, but it would also have changed the British Empire. And this is his mother is replying. I'm going to argue and indeed dictate, she said, clinking her rings. The English are out here to be pleasant. You know, because this guy's saying, you know, we want to bring order, we want to bring civilization. And his mother's just saying, no, you're here to be good. You know, and so be good. But because he won't actually allow the regret and questioning to touch him, he's carrying on in the way he's been, and the British Empire was carrying on. That's what Forster is trying to say. Here again is some Indian characters' observation about the British, saying they all become exactly the same, not worse, not better. I give any Englishman 2 years, be he Turton or Burton. It is only the difference of a letter. Because two of the English colonialists' characters are Turton and Burton. And Turton's probably a little bit better than Burton. But the Indian characters saying they're all the same. And I give any Englishwoman 6 months. Because basically the book says that people leave India thinking, oh yes, we want to go to India, we want to experience India, we want to help Indian people. But when they get to India, they just become racist and oppressive, and they retreat into their English culture and do not interact with the Indians. So saying that for this to happen, an Englishman, it will take him 2 years, but for an Englishwoman 6 months. So Forster is sort of saying, showing how the racism sort of develops as people are out in India. Again, this is an example of some really racist talk from a woman about Indian people. You're superior to them anyway. Don't forget that. You're superior to everyone in India except 1 or 2 of the Ranis, and they're on an equality. The Ranis were the sort of local rulers that had authority in their area and were allowed to rule, but sort of in alliance with the British. And that, you know, that view, that straight racist view that basically white European people were superior to the Indians, Forster is questioning and criticising in this book. He's exposing that that's what people believe, and that's what people did believe. You know, the only 80, 90 years ago in Britain, it would have been just accepted as fact that the white Europeans were superior to people from India, people from Africa. You know, so it's very true what Forster is saying here. Now, the key thing in the book is that some women that come out to India for the first time want to make friendships with some local Indian people. They want to see something of India, and on a particular trip to some caves called the Marabar Caves, something happens to one of the English women that causes her to make an accusation against Dr. Aziz of assault upon her. And here in court, the policeman, he was of Scottish origin, McBride, he remarked that the darker races are physically attracted by the fairer. So basically saying all sort of darker people, you know, desire lighter, whiter people, but not vice versa. Not a matter for bitterness, this, not a matter for abuse, but just the fact which any scientific observer would confirm. So this is just complete sort of racism, you know, the racist philosophy that was behind a lot of this colonialism and the British Empire. E.M. Forster is exposing it and questioning it. Okay, so this is the sort of thing that Forster is looking at and questioning. Here we have a conversation between two leading characters, Dr. Aziz and Mrs. Moore. Now, Mrs. Moore is a very sympathetic character, and there's an understanding between these two characters. And Dr. Aziz says, "You understand me. You know what others feel. Oh, if others resembled you." Rather surprised, she replied, "I don't think I understand people very well. I only know whether I like or dislike them." And Dr. Aziz says, "Then you are an Oriental." Now, in the book, Forster often puts as a comparison European or British rationalism, sort of thinking with the head, with sort of Indian just intuition and emotionalism. That's seen as a little bit of a something he's observing in terms of the differences between the different races. And this is you know, just an example of that. Again, here is another very important area of the book, all about the mystery of India to the British. How can the mind take hold of such a country? Generations of invaders have tried, but they remain in exile. The important towns they build are only retreats. You know, the British, they built things that kept them away from India itself. Their quarrels, the malaise of men who cannot find their way home. So the colonials fighting. India knows of their trouble. She knows of the whole world's trouble, to its innermost depths. She calls come through her 100 mouths, through objects ridiculous and august. August is very noble, kingly. But come to what? She is never defined. She is not a promise, only an appeal. So that's a bit of a sort of classic idea of India as this great mystery. Maybe you've been to India. It's a very overwhelming country. So E.M. Forster is talking about the mystery of India and how it confuses, especially the European mind. And finally, here's a classic English idea of how we compare England with other countries. Ah, dearest Grasmere, its little lakes and mountains were beloved by them all, romantic yet manageable. It sprang from a kindlier planet. So they are comparing a beautiful place in England with India, and how wild and how exotic and how difficult it is, with Grasmere. And Grasmere is in the Lake District. Do you remember the poem The Daffodils? You know, I wandered lonely as a cloud. That was set in Grasmere. So, you know, these British people are saying, oh, we long to be back where everything's manageable and easy and ordered and nothing terrible can happen, you know, against this India that we're scared of. Often you might see British people in Saudi Arabia, how they might, or American people, they'll just live in a compound and be scared of the outside world. That's a little bit of a European trait, a European something that Europeans do. You know, that they can very much get into their own culture. Maybe it's the same in Saudi. Maybe Saudi people in the UK or America huddle together and have a dream of their own country and are scared of a new country. Okay, so let's have a look at some final thoughts about A Passage to India. So Ian Forster wants to challenge the racism he has seen in the British Raj through his book. But the interesting thing with this book is it's clear from what he writes that he has a lot of the same racist ideas that he criticises. Like he sort of basically sees the Indians as all emotional and, you know, just living on intuition, heartfelt things. You know, and we all know that when it comes to computers and all sorts of things of the rational brain, India has dominated the world in the late 20th century. So Forster observes Indian society, but he doesn't observe it 100% correctly. It is a great book, but it does have some weaknesses. It ends with the idea that Dr. Aziz and the school teacher Cyril Fielding can only be friends when India becomes independent. So basically they can't be friends while there's this colonial relationship. The final line shows that Forster saw that independence was coming. Like Dr. Aziz speaks out like when will it, when can they be friends? And the last line is, even the earth and the sky seems to say, not yet. So it took another 25 years, but 25 years later, independence came. And Forster could see that's where things were going. Okay, so I hope I've managed to convey, to show you something of the effect of the British in India and the effect of India on the British. Okay, and so that's the end of lecture 11. Thank you.